For almost 40 years, pregnant Irish girls disappeared to have their babies in secret.
Their children were neglected, trafficked, and traumatized.
What happened to these women and their children?
And how did this story go untold for so long?
We're doing a full recap of the home babies on this episode of So Much Crime,
So Little Time.
But before we get to the show, just a reminder to subscribe to our Patreon, patreon.com/So Much Crime, So Little Time.
And also, don't forget to rate us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen, and to tell your friends about the show. We really appreciate it.
We love when we hear of new listeners to the show. So also let us know on our Instagram, So Much Crime _ So Little Time. Welcome to So Much Crime, So Little Time. I'm Dee.
And I'm Jeff. And before we start, we just want to give a warning that this episode is going to have spoilers for the home babies. We're going to discuss the whole series.
If you haven't listened yet, check out our preview episode on this show. It's the one before this one in your feed.
You can also find a link for the home babies in the notes of this podcast.
Okay, let's start off with a bit of a reminder. The home babies came out in 2018. It's from BBC Radio 4.
There are 10 episodes in total. They're pretty short. They're about 15 minutes or so each. And the host is Becky Milligan.
In our preview episode, we discussed episode 1, The Wall. We learned about Tuam, which is in County Galway in Ireland.
From 1925 to 1961, there was a home for unwed mothers and their babies. Everyone in the town seemed to know it was a really bad place with really bad things happening, but people generally didn't talk about it.
We also began hearing about a heroic local citizen who was determined to discover the truth and to let the public know what was going on behind the wall.
All right, Dee, let's discuss the home babies.
Right, let's start maybe with the host.
Becky Milligan. Yeah. What are your thoughts on Becky?
Okay, so I feel like she remained very empathetic. In the preview, I said how I liked her. I liked her a lot. I felt like she wanted to be interviewing these women and the people from the local area. She had she seemed to have quite a genuine interest in the story and also a genuine empathy for what had happened and how that had impacted the local people as well as obviously anyone who was in the homes.
Yeah, I think we talked about this in the preview episode. I think she struck that balance of being present. Like she definitely, we get a little bit of a sense of her, but it's not overpowering. It's not over editorializing. I think she's kind of everything that I look for in a host in terms of being organized, thorough, present, but not like too much in your face, not too much. Like there's no like sarcasm. There's no, she's not over present, I guess.
Yeah, I get that. There was also parts of me, I don't know, like I really did enjoy her and I thought she was kind of the perfect person to tell the story in a way. I think it was extremely important that it was a woman hosting this story and conducting the interviews with these people. But that's something we can come back to. Like
when we did the preview, I thought Catherine Corliss was going to be, she was described as like the Erin Brockovich of this crime, right? Like as this local citizen who was so determined to expose the story. And she does come up and she does play a pivotal role. But when I look back at these 10 episodes, they're not the people that I think about. I think about Michael, who was the American, right? He was the one who got sent to America at like age 3 and like sight unseen, got on a plane and was adopted by this.
I've never heard sight unseen with an adoption before.
It's bizarre, isn't it? I mean, this was also like 1949. And then his story of where he tries to go back and meet his birth mother. And first of all, the fact that he doesn't have a birth certificate. He can't get it takes him years to get a passport just to go to Ireland. Right? Like that's a story that's going to stick with me. And then the episode, so that was from the episode.
Is that just because he's an American?
That he couldn't get a passport.
Sorry, that came off really like aggressive or something. I didn't mean it like that. But I more mean, do you connect? Do you feel like you'll remember him because he's an American? You're like, well, this could have been,
no,
my dad or my, you know what I mean? Like, as in like, there's more of a connection there with it. Or is that why he's the first one that comes to mind?
No.
Or is it because he's a child who had been in one of these homes?
I think the idea of a 3-year-old getting on a plane unaccompanied and going off to meet a new family, like it's a very dramatic story. But I also think, maybe to a little bit lesser extent, the Survivors episode where we heard about PJ and Anne. So this was one boy and one girl who were born in this home and got sent off to families that adopted them. And PJ had a relatively good experience, right? Like he had a relatively loving family. He had problems being sort of socially ostracized. But then there was Anne, who had a miserable experience, right?
Yeah.
Like she was basically put to work. Like she was kind of hired as like an indentured, she was adopted as an indentured servant effectively.
And she had originally been adopted by someone else and
sent back, right? And then she was physically and seemingly emotionally abused by her adopted brother. And like that was such a sad story. Like that, the stories of some of these kids, as well as I think there was other people who popped up in this. Like there was the former priest and the former nun who we heard from, and I thought that was really powerful. Like even just the contextualizing of who they were. Like there was a priest, Tony Flannery, and then Margaret Lee was the former nun. And I mean, they were so critical of the church. Like I think they left because they disagree with the church over some of their policies and beliefs. But talking about how we got to this place, right? Like I think it was the priest who talked about the celibacy rule. Like I think he that was one of the things he disagreed with over the church, of the celibacy rule for priests and I guess nuns. But he was talking about priests and how priests, in his view, were responsible for some of this cruelty to these pregnant girls, partially because they were forced to be celibate. And so they look at these pregnant girls as something to be hated, something to be treated horribly. And like you extrapolate
also
that
the
out.
forced to be celibate, like disclaimer, a lot of them weren't.
Well,
they were giving the pretense of being celibate.
yeah, but I mean, even just having that as a rule, like what does that do to somebody, right? Like how does that affect people over the long term? It's not good.
Well, I mean, a lot has come out, especially recently, about priests and clergymen in Ireland and schools in particular. Like really horrendous stats are coming out that we've known about for so long. Like we're not shocked about it. Like they take so much ownership. They need to take so much ownership. The idea that like in the middle of the night a priest might knock on your door and be like, I heard your daughter's pregnant, get her out, I'm gonna sort this out. And then at mass on a Sunday might be like, I know that there's sins happening and things to be shameful of. Like it's just so
I wanted to ask
vile.
you about this because I think I grew up in the Catholic Church, but in America, where the Catholic Church does not have a significant amount of power, right? Like Christianity does, generally speaking, but more Protestantism than Catholicism. By the time you were sort of conscious of this in Ireland, had the Catholic Church sort of faded from its power? Because it's described here as having an immense amount of power in the 20th century, early 20th century especially, fading as we get into the end of the 20th century. Do you have any experience with that, or does that predate you?
Like it mostly predates it. Like it was never as strong as when we were there, or like as strong as my experience with the church. But I mean, it was, I don't know, I suppose all of this was coming out. Like a lot of stories were coming out in the late 90s and the start of the 2000s about like different priests around who they found out he has a family and he has a secret woman and a secret child and he's sending money, and like I don't know, there was just so much.
But you don't have a recollection of this. I mean, it's described in a way that is hard for me to imagine, of just how you have the church having essentially more power than the government.
Yeah. I mean, it's still the case, like in a lot of ways. Do you know, like I'm trying to think of the stat now. It's something like 92% of our primary schools, like our elementary schools in Ireland, are Catholic run. Like every day, technically, they're supposed to get like a religion class for 30 minutes a day. Like over their 5 hours a day, they're supposed to get 30 minutes of teaching time on religion. Like that's the kind of level you're at.
But then so there was the woman we heard about in episode 2, Mary Moriarty, who was the one who fell in the septic tank and kind of discovered all of the bundles of bones. And she has this quote that then they use in like the beginning of subsequent episodes where she says, I thought it was right the way things were. Mm-hmm. Which seems to be a bit of a prevailing attitude amongst many of the people in the town.
That was actually something I was going to ask you about. I find it so interesting because it feels like one of the main elements of the entire podcast is about a society, like, and how a society is constructed and how, secrecy and like the norms that are created within a society. Like, it was normal to know about this. It was normal to not speak about it. It was normal to not question it. And there's a lot of talk. And I feel like Becky Milligan, the host, was sometimes like shocked, which I don't know. I was a bit like, surely some of this was happening in England too. Like, it's not like shock, but she seemed shocked that like people were just going on with it, and people were turning blind eyes, or maybe there was like the feeling that people couldn't do anything. So why say anything? Because if you say something, then you're going to be in bad books of different people. Or, how maybe the society were at that time very brainwashed by the church.
Yeah.
They were just allowing them to rule over it. But this is all still happening around the world today. And you mentioned this in the preview episode. This is still happening in the world today. But whose business is it to fight for it? Like, whose business is it to fight it? Like, is it an outsider's business to go in and say, that's not right? Is it, the people who are living in it? Is it their place? Like, is it not even their place? Is it their duty to speak out about it?
You said earlier that you think it was important or necessary that this podcast was hosted by a woman.
Yeah.
Should it have been an Irish woman?
I don't know. That's a good question I hadn't considered. Personally, it didn't come to mind that it was bad that it was someone who was not from Ireland. Maybe in a way it was good that it was someone who was not from Ireland, because they haven't got the context, or maybe the initial biases, conscious or unconscious.
But like she can come from England, which is not a Catholic country.
No.
Right? And yes, it's close and it has its own problems. But I mean, that's a good point, right? Like, I can sit here and judge what's going on today in Afghanistan, right? Like, that's an extreme example in the religious rules that are made. But like, is it my responsibility to go in and reform that country?
And that's what I wonder. Like, I feel like people often talk about these things as if they know best, and like, you don't know best. But then also, there was just so much wrong happening at that time in Ireland.
Well, those are two different things, right? Like, it's easy to be sort of shocked and appalled by what's happening in a different place, but you can also be sort of ignorant, or it can be in a way inappropriate for you to be judging people just because they do things differently. Both those things can be true. It can be wrong, but
it's the balance though, and that's kind of what I have. Like even in terms of, say, like women wearing a hijab, like I feel like that's a conversation that often comes up. Not often, but I've heard it come up quite often, and people have these strong views as if one way or another that, it's by wearing it, you're doing X, Y, and Z to yourself as a woman. But also, I feel like in the conversation about women who wear hijabs, like, who am I to say I feel as a woman, if I had to wear a hijab, that I would have these feelings?
Yeah.
And that it does this to me, when I've heard accounts from some women who have worn hijabs, they feel empowered by it because they're keeping themselves secret and it's up to them, and like they have ownership over it. Obviously, there's another side to that where it's not up to them whether they're wearing it or not. There's a lot to discuss, but like, I feel like what was one of the main parts of this podcast was a little bit of, how did this happen? How did people let this happen? And then I think it comes down to what you were saying, is you find it so hard to imagine the church having so much power, because they didn't, even when you were growing up, like raised Catholic. Whereas in Ireland, that's just the way it was.
Yeah.
Like my mum and dad would say it, like, just the way it was.
I think that, yeah. Sorry, go on.
No, I need to stop my rant. You're supposed to interrupt me.
I think that's an important thing to reflect on as we listen to these stories and we have our sort of shock and moral outrage at the way different people do things differently.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, people from different cultures, from different places, with different norms. And it really isn't our place to judge whether that's right or wrong. And I think it's important to sort of check our moral indignation. Like,
yeah,
to a certain point, right?
Yeah, but like, I mean, with this story, like, we can check ourselves and say, like, people speaking out, I feel like we don't need to judge the people who didn't speak out. I feel that Catherine Corliss was amazingly brave, and we heard multiple times how people shunned her, people were annoyed at her, people didn't think it was the right thing to do, but she did it and she did speak out. But for anyone who thought Mary Moriarty, who said like that just felt like the right thing to do, it did, because it was at the time. And I feel like anyone who's judging that needs to take a breath and realize they weren't in the situation. It's very easy, as you say, to be shocked and appalled and say I'd do it differently, but none of us know how we're going to act in a situation like that.
I want to talk about Deirdre.
Yeah.
From episode 10. So, yeah, your namesake. So she was a woman who had been not in this home, but in, so the last one of these homes closed in 1996, which, pause for a second there, that's baffling. 1996.
Remember, we discussed the condoms.
Okay, so in this episode we hear about her story. So she got pregnant, thought at first she was sick. To me this was one of the most affecting episodes, because we went through her whole story. This is a fairly recent story, and she talks about the moment where she told her mother she was pregnant, and she talks about how her mom felt it would have been, or her perception was that it would have been better if she told her mom she had cancer than she was pregnant. That it was described as a moral problem, and she felt that she had no value. And also I think this was a fascinating glimpse into the mindset of these young women, right? Because she talked about how her family and her community, or I think she's specifically talking about her mother, made her feel so worthless and so immoral that's why she was amenable to being sent to one of these homes, right? Like, these girls went along with this, but that was a question I had to be. It's like, why did they subject themselves to this? But it's because they were condemned, they were ostracized, they were treated as less than human, as less than valuable, as compromised people. But you hear that she rooms with this 13-year-old girl who was pregnant, and that 13-year-old girl's story, like, that's a story that is so tragic, right? This is a girl who basically just spent her nights wailing for her mother. So Deirdre asked to be moved to a different room, and then we hear about like what her experience was like, and how her baby was born, and she thought he was the most beautiful thing in the world. And when she eventually went home, so she gave her baby up like they did, and she went home and she was crying, just sobbing every night, and her mother was basically like, "What's wrong with you?" And she said that she missed her baby, and her mother said, "How could you? You only knew him for 3 days." Like, the coldness of that was
but just, like, her mother grew up in coldness. I think a lot of Ireland was in coldness.
But her mother knew what it was like to have a baby.
Yeah, I just don't know if you know. I don't know. I don't know if you know, like, the extent of the cold, sterile environment that was going on in Ireland at the time. But like, empathy wasn't there, because it was all about how you were perceived. Even when you look at the priests and all, like, they're like, let's be perceived as celibate, let's be perceived as like holier than thou. And for families, if you didn't have a child who went to the priesthood and have a daughter who goes to become a nun, like, that's bad. But to have a daughter who gets pregnant, like, that's so bad. Okay. Like, that's the worst thing morally that could happen. And so the mother is probably trying to save face. Like, she had other kids. She's trying to go with, in her eyes, she's trying to protect these other children. And I feel like that level of, like, fear for her mother, for the other kids that she's had, that level of fear probably for Deirdre herself. I'm not saying that what her mother did was right by any means, but I'm just saying, like, we have to put ourselves in her shoes. She's a protector. You're a parent, you're a protector.
I guess, and this maybe speaks to the format of this episode, where we it's so short that we only get a little bit of this perspective. But, like, the idea that Deirdre would spend hours or days with her baby and then just grieve this loss so significantly, I can empathize with that, because I remember the moment my older son was born, and that switch from not being a parent to being a parent, and it happened in seconds, right, of seeing him when he was just born, and I suddenly, like, everything changed.
Mm-hmm.
My whole perception on life changed.
Yeah, but you grew up in a time where it's okay to have those feelings, and those feelings are
Sure. Yeah.
strong and whatever. Again, you have to remember, in Ireland at that stage, women were just flashing the babies out. I know I would have heard about women in that generation who go through, say, like a miscarriage, and they're just like sent home, go through it yourself. That's not nothing to do with us. Like, you'll be grand, get over it, have another baby. Like, it's cold. It was cold. It was cold about everything. It was get up and get on with it. That's the tagline. Get up and get on with it. And her mother was probably trying to get up and get on with it, and she didn't have the emotional intelligence to deal with this situation because she was never taught how to deal with the situation in an empathetic manner. She's trying to, and here, I'm not defending her mother, but I'm just saying we cannot judge something like that when we haven't been in an environment that she grew up in.
I think that's right. I think I just have a hard time not emotionally connecting with this in a way that it makes that challenging. Because the other,
me too. Like, and your man is it PJ who was the little boy who had been, so like his whole thing about, you know, he was seen as a bastard, and you know, he was called all these names, and like if he started dating women and or courting women or doing a line, whatever they say, or he said in the podcast, I can't remember exactly, but with the woman, and she found out then that he had, where he had like grown up, that they would have nothing to do with him. That to me, like, that's so hard, because not that the women did anything wrong, but the babies are just, as he said, like, I didn't choose
right,
to enter the world like this. I didn't choose to be born, like, I was just born. And that whole side of it I found really hard. And I loved that, like, in a way, about Catherine Corless being like very open about her not being kind to the children in her class who the home babies. She, you know, told a story about that, and she was obviously very embarrassed about the story. It's like hard to look back at yourself and realize what a weapon you were, or like how cruel you were.
What about the fathers of these babies?
Misogyny. Doesn't matter.
They say 35,000 women and girls went through these homes.
Yep.
That means there are arguably 35,000 boys and men that had children that I presume they were so either maybe didn't even know about, or were so emotionally removed from, detached from. That's not part of this story, right? And I presume it's not part of this story because there is no story there. They played no role in this story, effectively. They played a role, but that role was brief. And
real brief, I'd hazard to guess that. Yeah. And that goes back to Ireland of its time, and likely a lot of places of its time. It's still an issue now, I think, obviously, with how things work, that men and boys can just turn their back and walk away.
All right, I have one more question. It's described in episode 8, it's called The Church. So in that episode, it's talked about how, like, okay, so what is the punishment for the church? And it's described as the punishment of the church is that they're dying out. They're irrelevant. Basically, priests and nuns are aging out and becoming less and less relevant, and their increasing irrelevancy and being a thing of the past is punishment enough. And that's my question for you. Like, is that punishment enough for the crimes that were committed?
You know, part of me thinks no. Like, part of me thinks obviously the people who were involved in this need to be held accountable. But if you, for your entire life, even in some cases, pretend to stand for something and fight for something and spread the word about something, and it was so powerful, but as you go through your life having this in your core, and you're spreading the word and you're spreading the word, and you think this is you and this is your entire life and you have sacrificed everything for it, and as you age, people care about you less and you become irrelevant, is that not the worst thing that can happen, because you feel you haven't done your duty of spreading the word and making sure everyone, you know, is on side?
So you think that is a pretty strong punishment?
I think before I listened to this podcast, I probably would have said no, but I felt it was really powerful hearing from the priest and the nun basically saying they're becoming irrelevant, like nobody cares. Like I went to basically a convent in my secondary school, but the nuns at that stage had kind of stepped away. There was no nuns teaching us.
Okay, so I would agree that it's a good punishment, but I also like, okay, so to bring
What's enough though?
okay
Like
to,
how do you get to enough when the women have gone through this? Like their shame and their lives that have been centered around this, it's never going to change. The babies who are in the ground, the women who are in the ground, like never going to change.
sure. And this, I mean, this is a that's a broader question, but okay, so I was just reading about Pope Francis just did a tour as we're recording this. He did a tour of the South Pacific, and he visited several islands in the South Pacific. And one of the stories that came out from that was the church's history of basically taking a priest who was abusing children, who was molesting children, and saying, "All right, well, you did that on this island. Let's just move you to a different island and pretend that didn't happen." And that stuck out to me because that happened all over the world, right? That was happening to priests in America. That was happening to priests everywhere. And to me, that idea of it just seems so much more egregious when it's like, okay, you're molesting children in Tahiti. Let's move you to Easter Island, like these tropical islands where it's like, fuck these people. They deserve to be punished more cruelly than just getting to be shuffled around and live out their days, maybe in obscurity, maybe in irrelevance, maybe in diminished stature. But like to me, you committed crimes that are horrific to an extreme extent, right? And I'm extrapolating it out to priests who molested children. That's a different crime than the crime here. But here we're talking about trafficking babies. We're talking about neglect and cruelty to children and young women, and to an extreme extent, right? Malnourishing children. These children grew up without love and care in a horrendous state. And I don't think fading into irrelevance is strong enough. Like I think that treating young women and children
No,
that
but
way.
by the time this story all comes out and people actually give a shit about it and are feeling like they can talk about it, what do you do? Like it's different if this comes out and the people are still alive and well and there, but they're not. I totally get what you're saying. But if that was happening right now, yeah, of course. If this is happening right now, let's fight against it, of course. But this happened so long ago. By the time people started speaking about this, and by the time there was allowed to be outrage about it, we kept hearing the snippet from, I know it as the Late Late Show, when there was non-stop clapping for Catherine Corless and the standing ovation. To me, I listened to that a number of times. I felt so emotional because that's the society saying we are finally out. We're out from under that power. Somebody has stood up and brought that story to light. That is people saying someone is the Erin Brockovich of Ireland for this. But like, what else can they do? And that's my point about the judgment of society, and like it's time. People were handcuffed. They could there was nothing they could do. There's a similar story going around about a policeman recently in one of your states who shot someone, and it turned out there was past issues with him that people just kept ignoring about, like violence, domestic violence, gun violence, all of this. And what was that? What was happening? He was shuffled around. He needs to be punished now. He absolutely needs to be punished for that now, because he's in the here and now. Like these people, like this is, it's too long ago, and the fading into existence is the long-term biggest two fingers to you. That's all that you can do. Like that's the worst thing that could really happen to the church in Ireland.
I think it's okay. I hear you.
God, I got angry, didn't I?
A little bit.
Did I get too angry?
No. The fact that this, I guess, effectively stopped in this specific case in, 60 years ago or so means that most of the people who maybe deserve more severe punishment are dead and gone. Mm-hmm. But the last one of these closed in 1996. There are people who participated in this crime who are still very much alive. And I think the Catholic Church as an institution deserves punishment for this, more so than just being diminished. This institution shielded these crimes. This institution supported these crimes.
And that's the part that feels like absolutely needs to happen more so. And that's why, for me, and a lot of people in Ireland don't agree with me, but for me, having so much power within primary schools is that's wild. Like, no, thank you. Out you go.
I guess I believe in a stronger reckoning for the scope. And I mean, you could find a parallel in reparations in the US for slavery, right? Slavery ended 150 years ago, but the legacy of that, right? Like the consequences of that are still harming people today. And I think there are people who make a case that that was so long ago. How can that possibly be relevant now? And how can you possibly justify reparations to the descendants of slaves now? But if you look at the data, the effects of what happened, what stopped happening in the 1860s is still harming people today, is still affecting society today. And so now we're talking about something that happened in the 1960s, the 1990s. I think there's still reparations to be made.
No, it's not that I disagree with you. I do think Ireland has come on so far with women and how it treats women. I mean, a few years ago, like abortion was legalized in Ireland. There's still a long way to go to give women of Ireland the choice and the care that if they want it. But we're going in the right direction there. You know,
unlike the US,
feel,
where we're going the wrong direction.
I'm not saying that's not what I'm saying.
No, I know.
I'm not. But I'm saying that, like, you know, Ireland is trying to equalise things now and is trying to bring things forward. And as I said, I think there's a long way to go. But I just think there's very little that you can do. The step back from the church, I get what you mean.
I have a lot of moral indignation over this topic, and maybe it's some of that is personal and not about this case and not about Ireland.
Yeah, I think maybe this goes back to what was said in there. Like, people in Ireland like knew about this, so it just feels like a thing that happened that we all knew about. Whereas for you, I know you had said, like, look, it's not just Ireland; it happened in a lot of places. But for you, hearing this story was probably more shocking and brought more feelings forward than it did for me, because I knew what we were getting into here.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
We've noted that maybe you won't remember the host in a year's time. But I will say, for me, the standout element of this podcast is it's emphasizing women, or one woman in particular, who's fighting for something right, and she's being listened to. She's been listened to by more people than she thought she would. Not by the people she thought she'd be listened to, because she thought it would be the guards. She thought it would be the church. She thought it would be the legal system. They didn't listen, but the media listened, which made everyone else have to fucking listen. And that, to me, was like a story of her persevering and her just going against it and not caring when she met up with the nuns and they were pissed off with her and wanted her to stop chatting about it. She just kept fighting, and it felt like a really poignant end to this podcast when you're thinking about her fighting for it, because nobody could fight. Nobody felt like they could fight back when this was all happening.
I agree with that. I think at the end of the day, I may not remember the host, like her who she is not prominent, but that's not really the point. Like, Catherine Corliss is part of the point. The women and the children who we heard from, that's the point. And that's going to stick with me, right? I think this is one of the most powerful stories that we've talked about on this show. And it was covered, I think, in a really interesting way.
Well, I think it was made more powerful by the quick, short episodes. No bullshit, no filler. And the music was just on point.
The music was on point. And I think and this is maybe getting a little bit too in the weeds, but like the organization of it, right? Like it was very well laid out. It had like, we often criticize some of these shows for just sort of feeling a little bit thrown together, and like we would do it differently. I don't have notes on that other than I kind of want more, but it's hard to argue with 10 episodes where each one tackles a very specific part of this story, and when you step back from it, you have a whole story. Right? Like, I feel like we got all of the most important parts. She got interviews with relevant people for everything she wanted to convey,
which was pretty impressive.
Yeah, Yeah. And some of these stories, it is impressive that she was able to get these stories from these people, right? To hear from a former priest and a former nun, to hear from a woman who went through this fairly recently, to hear from a kid who ended up, well, he's a grown man now, but who ended up being sent off to America, as well as people who stayed in Ireland. Like the collage of all the people that we heard from is remarkable. Like I thought when we started this, it was going to be Catherine Corliss all the way through.
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
At the end of the day, what's your high level? Do you feel like this was worth the time?
Definitely. I think it's worth the time.
Yeah.
It's tough of parts to listen to, but I think it's worth the time.
And I actually don't think it was as tough as it could have been.
Well, because she didn't lean into the drama. There was no need to dramatize it. It's so messed up in itself that just telling the story without adding any of the, like, without adding like evocative language or without like trying to heighten the trauma or the gruesomeness of it all.
It's not salacious. It's not grisly.
No.
For a story that really could be.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That those elements are there, but she doesn't lean into that. She leans into the human element. And I thought that was remarkable. This is an exceptional podcast. I'm really glad we listened to it.
Yeah, me too.
Before we go, just a reminder to join our Patreon. On our Patreon, you'll get early access to future shows. We have some really cool bonus content that you don't get to hear in these episodes. Plus, you also support us in making the show. It's patreon.com/so-much-crime, so little time.
Okay, Jeff, what's up next?
All right, Dee. Next time, we're going to go to New York. Specifically, we're going to the Bronx in New York. And I want to ask you a question. Dee, what percentage of people that are in prison in the United States do you think are innocent?
How many people are in prison what percentage?
What percentage? It's not zero, right? Like there's some percentage of people who are innocent.
2%.
2%. All right. So if 2% of the people who are currently in prison in the United States are innocent, that means 38,000 people.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's a lot of people. There's currently just under 2 million people in prison in the United States, which that's a whole different topic that we're not going to get into. We're going to talk about one person in particular, Richard Rosario, who was convicted and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison for murder. But he had 13 witnesses who attested to his alibi. Yeah, 13 witnesses. All right, Dee. So next time we're covering a podcast, it's called 13 Alibis. It's a Dateline podcast that is coming up on the next So Much Crime.
So Little Time. So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of MimeGov Media. The executive producer is Paxton Calariso. Our associate producer is Blythe Ty. Theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show in your podcast app. Don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening.